Good morning. Let's all stand up together and get to know each other a little bit before we begin. Let's do a thought experiment to launch our Max session today. Let's pretend we're not here, okay? Let's pretend we are not here. We are not in Philadelphia. It's not raining outside. It's not humid. No, we have woken up and we have stepped outside and we are in Japan. And we see a friend of ours across the conference room in Japan, and we walk up to them and we greet them as any good Japanese person would greet another Japanese person. You would look them in the eye and you would say, "Ohayo gozaimasu." Go ahead and say that. And then you would bow at a roughly 15-degree angle at the person next to you. So turn to the person next to you, bow 15 degrees, and say, "Ohayo gozaimasu." Very good. Only a couple of you bumped heads, which was really cute. Excellent. All right, let's do another one. Let's pretend we're not here. It's not Philly. It's not raining. It's not humid. We've been lifted up out of this place. We've been transported across space and time, and we've landed in Italy. And we see a friend of ours across a crowded conference room, and we walk up to them and we greet them the way that any good Italian would greet another one. You would say, "Buongiorno." And then you would deliver one kiss to the left cheek and one kiss to the right. Please do that right now. Buongiorno, a kiss on the left and a kiss on the right. Very good, excellent, well done. I noticed a few too many air kisses, which I guess was due to the coffee breath in the room today. All right, let's do another. Let's pretend we're not here. We've been lifted up out of this room, transported across space and time, and we landed in Kenya. And we see a friend of ours across a crowded conference room, and we greet them like any good Kenyan would greet another good Kenyan. You reach out your right hand, and you grasp the hand of the person next to you. You take your left hand, and you place it atop, and you bow, and you say, "Hubari Gani." Hubari Gani. Excellent. Very well done. All right, last one. Let's pretend we're not here. Transported, space, time, travel, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Look at the person next to you and say with as much earnestness as you can muster, "May the force be with you." Some of you geeked out on that. I love it. All right, you can have a seat. We start with that because the idea of learning storytelling as a tool, as a force and as a power that you can muster and marshal and do all sorts of amazing things with, learning storytelling is a lot like learning a new language. You know some of the basics, it's sort of innately in you to understand what's going on around you. Storytelling is a language that can motivate people and connect people, just like any other language around the world. But when you first try to use it, sometimes it's clumsy and sometimes it's awkward and the words don't come out exactly right, and that's okay. We learn it together. So today I want to give you 14 minutes of ideas around stories. And then tomorrow I'm doing a session around how stories drive diversity towards innovation in your organization, so I hope you'll come to that. But today, pretend this is Language 101. Just a few of the basics, and don't worry if you get it all right. But because we're talking about storytelling, we should start with the story, right? So the most important decision you're going to make today, would you like a story about beer, or would you like a story about whiskey? Beer. All for beer. All for whiskey. The whiskeys have it. If you've ever visited the Scottish Highlands, then you know they live up to their name. They layer height upon height of dramatic peaks and rocky gorges, of cliff-top mansions and castles and frozen, frigid little lakes and snow with geese and grouse and goats crunching on top of it. And of course, around every bend, the whole reason you went to Scotland, the distilleries. My wife and I spent a week visiting as many of those distilleries as we could a few months ago. I should tell you that her original plan was for us to go to the Champagne region of France, but I talked her into going to Scotch whiskey country instead. I also do a negotiation keynote, Jason, if you want to bring me back. I tell you, I pulled it off. If you've been, you know it's a little bit like Napa, except in Napa, every mile or so you're running into a vineyard or a winery, but in Scotland, every mile or so you're stumbling into a distillery. And when you've been drinking for a couple days, you're literally stumbling into the distilleries. If you come down off the top of the Cairngorm Mountains, highest mountain range west of the fjords, you slip into Speyside, and you hit the jackpot. It's a string of the most iconic distilleries in the history of Scotch making. Macallan, Balvenie, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Glenglassaugh, all the famous ones you've heard of and the ones that you wish you could buy and have on your shelf, they're all there. And if you go to one, you begin to get an inkling. You go to two, you really start figuring it out. These places act like they're selling you alcohol, but what they're really selling you is a story. A history, a legacy, of making the same product in the same way, in the same place for 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. In one of these distilleries, we stumbled upon a thick-accented young Scottish gentleman who told us this story that I bring to you today across thousands of miles and many, many days. It was the mid-1990s, and this particular distillery was celebrating its 150th anniversary. Century and a half of making the product on site. To celebrate correctly, they thought they'd have a big party. So on one Saturday afternoon, they invited back on site all the employees who had ever worked there, who were still living, of course, and all the employees who worked there that day. And they brought them in that one place at that time to be together. And you know, when you get that many employees together in one place at one time, they start cabining off into their own expertises and their own fields and disciplines. So in one corner, you had the coopers, the men and women who bend the wood into barrels and hammer on the metal and fire it through the kiln to get that smoky flavor into the whiskey. In one corner, you had the master distillers. I don't know if you know much about master distillers, but they're trained from very young ages. They can never have wasabi. They can never have sriracha. They can never have red pepper, nothing that would threaten the olfactory capacity to taste the whiskey and its quality as it ages. And in another corner, you had the delivery guys, the men and the women who brought the product to market. You had 4 generations, remember, on site at one time. So you had a guy who remembered what it was like to take the barrels, put them in the boats, and send them off with the boys when they went to war. You had a guy who drove the first double-axle truck that had ever been used by the distillery to bring the product to market. And you had some young kid who was going to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. And it was in that corner that something particularly interesting started to happen. Amongst the air of celebration and everybody raising a wee dram in honor of the distillery that they loved and had given their lives to, you began to see a young gentleman become increasingly agitated. His face was growing red and his gestures were growing grand and his volume of his voice was raising. And it wasn't because he was inebriated, it was because he was angry. He had a story to tell and he was telling it to his fellow delivery man. He believed that the distribution strategy of this particular distillery made no sense. It was defying all logic to him. Here's how they did it. On Monday morning, he had to do all of the long-distance deliveries to the shops and the vendors that were farthest away from the distillery. On Friday, he had to do all the deliveries to the nearest destinations that were closest to the distilleries, and then he triaged all the rest in between by distance. This made no sense to him, he said. It violated all of the agility and responsiveness that we want in a marketplace, but he had raised his hand about it a dozen times, and he had just been patted on the head and said he was a wee little lad, and he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. So amongst a friendly audience, he begins sharing this story. And as he becomes increasingly angry, across the circle, an older gentleman, graying white hair, wrinkles carved into his face, a little bit stooped over, retired for many years, begins to smile and get a twinkle in his eye because he knows the young man has every reason to be angry. Here's why. World War II. Fuel was rationed aggressively across the British Isles, including in Scotland. To get the product to market the way that this distillery needed to, they actually had to put the trucks in the garage because they didn't have fuel, and they had to deliver this product the way they had a generation before, pull out the cart, hitch it up to a horse, and drive it to market. On Monday, the horses were well rested from a long weekend, so they did all the long-distance deliveries then. On Friday, the horses were tired from a very long week of work, so they did all the near-distance deliveries then, and they triaged all the rest in between. In one context, this makes perfect sense. In another context, it's the stupidest plan you've ever heard. But because decade after decade after decade of habit loop had been formed in their heads, the neural pathways were so strong that even though people would raise their hand and say, "Why are we doing this?" no one could change the pattern. Until one day, amidst the air of celebration, a young kid tells a story. A month later, they had settled on a new distribution strategy. And I don't have to tell you that, of course, today they run on sophisticated software that agile responds to inventory management in the process. But they've kept this story, and they call it a lighthouse story, which, if you've been to Scotland, you know has particular resonance as well. The lighthouse stories keep you guided in the right direction. They keep you from smashing against the rocks. They tell the story at every onboarding, every big team meeting, every celebration, every anniversary to remind themselves, history's good, but it's our job to interrogate every single day the work we do and ask if there's a better way to do it. And if there is, let's find it. Okay, pretty good story. Decent story. If you like scotch, it was better. For you beer drinkers in the back, come find me later. I'll give you the other story. But roll it up in a ball for a second. Set it over here and ask yourself, what just happened while we were talking about Scotland? In the past 4.5 minutes since I began telling this story and sharing you these pictures, what happened on this stage? Okay, we all have a sense inside of ourselves that stories do something to us, but what do? Well, they did what they did just now. They take different people from different walks of life and different places around the world, and for a little while, organizes all of us around a common center, the experience of narrative. And just as it reorganizes all the people in this room, it also reorganizes information. It takes ideas and fragments of meaning that are disparate and unorganized, and it puts them together in meaningful relationship to one another so that the sum is greater than the parts. And because it can reorganize people, and because it can reorganize information, story has the potential to reorganize the world. Because a good story, well told, penetrating you just the right way, means you go back out into a world that should look a little bit different than the world you left behind. So you learned in my bio that I've spent the last 10 years studying what it is that stories do and how they're made up. So I did graduate work in religion, which is really just the history of all the stories that refuse to die, no matter how many times people tried to kill them. Human beings are never more creative than they are when they're trying to do something bad to somebody who believes something differently than they do. And then I did graduate work in American literature, which is really just a collection of stories that would never die. They got lodged in our cultural consciousness, and we just keep telling them over and over and over and over again. And then I ran a literary firm in New York for many years, selling books to magazines and book publishers, running Hall of Famers and athletes and movie stars and some Real Housewives, not my finest hour. And what I was looking for amongst all that is sort of what are the common principles that bind story together and make it powerful? And so all I do today are things like this. I go to organizations and companies and I give them tools and I give them services that help them capture the stories that are already innately inside them, but turn them on in more powerful ways to get things done. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's the first tool I want to give you. The idea that every great story has a similar shape. Now this might sound strange to you because stories don't feel like they should be spatialized. They are experiential, they wash over you, they carry you along. But if you looked at every great story, you would notice on two axes that actually they follow the same vectors. So let's take a look at it. Let's do two axes for every great story you've ever heard. The first axis is GI. G stands for good fortune. Wealth and prosperity and happiness and love and connection and affirmation and all the great things all of us want in our lives. I stands for ill fortune. Loss and disappointment and despair and fear and anxiety and disconnection, all the things none of us want in our lives. GI is the first axis. The second is BE. B stands for beginning and E stands for electricity. Good. BE. Every great story has a similar shape. Let's try it out. There is a man once upon a time. We're going to put him slightly towards G, good fortune, slightly above average, because that's the way all men like to imagine themselves. He's moving along through life. He's got dreams and aspirations, places he wants to go, people he wants to meet, things he wants to accomplish. And as he's going through life's journey with all of these good plans, something happens. Oh, damn it, he falls into a hole. And he's down there in the hole looking back on all the things he was going to do before he was unexpectedly tripped up. And he's cursing and he's shaking his fist at the sky and he's blaming the fates and he thinks the whole world is turned against him until, while in the bottom of the hole, he remembers something. There's a hidden staircase. There's that secret tunnel. He's got a friend up there he can yell at who's going to throw a rope down to him and pull him out. It's going to rain and the water's going to lift him up. Doesn't matter what fairy tale or legend or myth you're in, something happens at the darkest moment of the journey. In the valley of the shadow of death, something turns on, something triggers, a game-changing moment occurs, and the man lifts himself up out of the hole to greater heights than he ever thought possible. We love that story. We love it. And we tell it to ourselves again and again and again whenever we need a second act, whenever we need a comeback, whenever we need a turnaround, whenever last quarter or last year wasn't what we wanted it to be, whenever the last relationship wasn't what we wanted it to be, whenever we need a change, this is the story we tell ourselves. Transformation's possible even in the darkest moments. Let's do another. There is a man, slightly below average because that's how all women like to imagine all men. He too is on life's journey, traveling upward, hoping to accomplish great things, and he's middling, he's normal until one day something grand happens. He meets a girl, and suddenly all is light and love and bad poetry and chocolate and flowers and everything's going well and all is possible that he never thought was possible until, damn it, he's a loser. And he blows it up. And he's looking back on this great life he could have had if he hadn't been such a moron until something changes. He gets a job and a haircut, new set of clothes. His friends tell him to stop being an idiot. He goes to therapy. I don't know. Something happens at the bottom of the valley. And you know what happens. Last 10 minutes of romantic comedy. He chases after the girl, catches her right before she gets on the plane. They all live happily after. This is the story we like to tell ourselves. We map it onto our own romantic adventures and misadventures. In fact, if I asked many of you about the stable relationship that you're in now, it would probably look something like this. Early possibility tripped up by uncertainty, and then the comeback and the stability that you always wanted at the top of the mountain. Okay, that's the story we love, but it doesn't just apply to traditional, timeless archetypes. It also applies to other things, pop culture narratives that might be a little bit different than timeless. But before we go there, why don't you take a look at this? There are phases that are involved here. Classical literary theorists say good stories abide by three: Orientation, where the hell are we? What are the rules of the game? What do we want? Disorientation, the fall from grace, the collapse, the loss, and then reorientation. How are we going to turn this thing back up around and get to a place that we want to be? I like that, but I like this better. Think of every great story that has stuck with you as being framed in this way, establishing the possible, confronting you with loss and disappointment, and then giving you a chance to struggle your way back up the mountain. It's that struggle piece that defines our connection with any great story we've ever read or seen or heard. Would we fight alongside this hero or heroine to make their way back up? I think that's good, but here's what I like more. That every great pivot, every great story has 4 pivot points. 4 moments when the energy and the direction of the story is transitioned into something different. And here's your takeaway. If you can build stories that own these 4 pivots I'm about to give you, then you emotionally engage, connect, and persuade audiences of all kinds, across cultures, across organizations, across generations. The first one is once. Establishment and kickoff and initiation. The second pivot is the one that really gets you engaged in the story. It's the roller coaster, as I call it. It's the roller coaster pivot, but you thought you were going in one direction, but this unexpected thing happened. You were going after this goal, however, this thing came into your life and transitioned it. The energy here captures you downward into the struggle and frustration of what it means to be alive. The third pivot is the most beautiful. Until. Highly underappreciated as a preposition, generally. It's a great word because it tells you in 2 syllables, hey, everything that comes after is going to be fundamentally different than everything that came before. This is the game change moment of every great story, when the hero or heroine marshals internal and external resources to change the direction of their journey. And the last one is, at last. Successful conclusion, denouement, a satisfying ending that makes you close the book and go, oh, I've got to tell somebody about this. The ending that everybody wanted. Okay, so if these are the 4 pivots, in fact, let's do a cheap mnemonic device and repeat them to ourselves. What are the 4 great pivots of every story? Once, but, until, at last. Good, take those with you and then apply it to stories that you might not have expected. All right, here we go. Let's try it out here. I know you don't think it's going to work. Give me 3 minutes and I promise it will. 2 axes, good fortune, ill fortune. Beginning, electricity, somebody started. In West Philadelphia, born and raised, in a playground's where I spent most of my days. Somebody back there's doing well. Chilling out, maxing, relaxing, playing some b-ball outside of the school. Good, all right, very good, excellent, well done. All right, so we're slightly up towards good fortune, right? We're up here on the scale because it's Will Smith and he looks the same as he did in 1994, so he's doing well. And he's got an established status quo. Once, here's where we are, West Philadelphia, born and raised, everything's going well. But you know what happens, right? But a couple of guys, they were up to no good. Started making trouble in the neighborhood. What? Got one little fight and my mom got scared. She said, Auntie and your uncle in Bel Air, which is hell for a boy from West Philadelphia. Now, the coolest thing about this is that he told you this was coming. The beginning of the rap says, hey, sit right down. I'm going to tell you a story about how what? My life got flipped, turned upside down. That's foreshadowing, right? Poetry in Will Smith. So he's got a status quo. It's flipped upside down. He's built, but you know how it ends, right? Pulled up to the cab around 7 or 8, and I yelled to the cabbie, yo home, smell you later. And I looked at my what? Kingdom. I was finally there to sit on my throne as the prince. Kingdom, throne, and prince, all in like 7 words, right? It doesn't get any more archetypal than that. And it's Will Smith in a comedy of questionable quality in the mid-1990s. Let's do one because, hey, I'm generationally sensitive to the crowd. Good. Slightly above average, it's the story of a lovely lady who was bringing up 3 very lovely girls. Good. All of them had hair of gold, like their mother, the youngest one in curls. Good. Perfect little Aryan family, 1976. It's the story of a man named Brady who was bringing up 3 boys of his own. They were 4 men living all together. What? Wait. What? They were what? But! They were all alone. That's right. And then, of course, the best part of any story, what's the next word? Till the one day when this lady met this fellow and they knew that it was much more than a hunch that this crew would somehow be a family. That's the way. Became everybody. The Brady Bunch. No? All right, fine, good. The shape of all good stories is the same, and this is the takeaway. Come see me tomorrow. We'll talk about how this applies to different organizations, especially awakening the stories that already reside inside you. And if you give yourself a map and you give yourself signposts and wayfinding elements like these pivots, you begin to put structure to things as boring as emails, to things as boring as your quarterly presentations, to things as boring as your email updates and your annual reports. They become living things, because they contain the emotional triggers that drive people to comprehension, understanding, connection, and even change. Good? Pleasure being with you. Thanks. Next up.